I have to confess I'm relatively new to Alice's work, but I was in contact with her probably about 6 weeks ago now, I think it was, Alice.
Yep.
And we had a fascinating chat because for a long time I've been kind of fascinated by the interrelationship between the cognitive line and the social emotional line. And what exactly is going on? We seem to know very little about how these two systems in the brain or in the body are interrelated and interconnected. And this is actually an area that Alice has been thinking about and working on for some while. So today, really, really pleased that Alice can join us and tell us about her work. And by the way, she also writes an extremely insightful, fascinating, interesting blog on the mind of the coach, which I've been reading avidly in recent weeks,
Oh,
which
thank
I
you.
heartily recommend anybody who's in the coaching business to have a look at. So thank you, Alice. I think without further ado, I should hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such a generous introduction. I'm actually quite nervous because there are so many people in this room whose wisdom I respect so deeply and from whom I've learned so much. So I really come with a learner mind as much as a sharing intention. Because I think, and also this is such a beautiful audience for this type of content or for the content that I'm passionate about, because you're not here to learn about it. You're here to co-create, and you too are doing this work in the world. So I am really, really curious what you make of the little thread that I'm going to share, and how you see it weaving into the bigger picture of this work that we're all part of. So very humbled and very grateful to be here. My intention that I kind of came with initially, and I'm still holding it, is to keep the intro part very, very light, because I'm assuming already a foundation of knowledge, and kind of invite you into the thick of what I found in my own research, in hopefully an experiential way rather than a theoretical way. Would that work for everyone? Yeah? Awesome. Okay. So just a bit of background and context. I've come into adult development research from a background as a practitioner, a facilitator, a coach in my home country, Romania. So I'm Romanian and migrated to Australia a few years ago. We have a really interesting cultural context that I think has informed the work of those of us who have ended up in this field, because we didn't really have generations ahead of us to learn from. So there was this before 1989 and after 1989 kind of two worlds, which have completely and profoundly shaped my own upbringing and my own history, but also the context in which I've ended up doing this work and other people like me have ended up doing this work. So we have in my home country a whole generation of consultants who are now in their 40s, who started this work of consulting and facilitating in their early 20s. Which I think in Western countries doesn't really happen, because you would have a whole career before you go into consulting. Whereas for us, there was no corporate world to learn from. So everybody kind of jumped into this. And those of us who were drawn to training and development kind of started doing training and development as a thing. So I've been immersed in it and grew up in it in a sense as a practitioner. Living it and also supporting others on this journey. And I've had a lot of frustrations over the years. And the biggest frustration has been one that I'm pretty sure we share, or other people in this room share, around the knowledge action gap. You know what to do, but you don't do it. And leaders know what to do and they don't do it. And we were doing all of these soft skills programs with all of these techniques for dialogue and, good conversations and did delegation tools and all of that stuff, and people were just enjoying the learning and then not applying it. So for me, this has been this obsessive question around, what does it take to embody what you're learning? What does it take to actually have the maturity to be that person that theoretically would be good or effective to be? So this kind of, I carried this through 15 years of practice till I felt like I need to understand it more deeply. And I stepped into research to do a PhD in it. And as part of that, I moved to Australia and took life over, or started life over, which in itself, if we think disorienting dilemmas and heat experiences, has been a really good case study of what a massive disorienting dilemma can look like. in terms of dissolution of identity, kind of no more feedback around, who you are and what the value that you bring is. So in a way, I lived my research as I was conducting my research. And I was really lucky to be given access to one of the largest leadership development programs here in Australia and New Zealand. 250 leaders, cross-sector, cross-industry. Every year we're going through this program. And the program itself was developmental without being explicitly presented as developmental. But Keegan was part of the faculty, and Amy Edmondson was part of the faculty, and Ron Heifetz was part of the faculty. So this was this just amazing opportunity for me to see the impact of this collective holding space these amazing people were creating. And it so happened I ran the study in 2020. When all of a sudden the program went online, everybody went in lockdown, everybody was deeply traumatized and going through this program at the same time. And I had this question in my mind: how do you actually capture learning as it is happening? Because in previous research around the developmental impact of programs like this, people would look at the end and kind of ask participants, what was the experience? But 6 months later, it's not the same as you are in it. So I invited these people to journal through the program. Every week they would be journaling around actual stuff that was happening in their lives, not necessarily in the program itself. So people shared losing loved ones. They shared the anxiety of not knowing how to reorganize their businesses. They shared a lot of personal stuff in the journal entries, and they also gave me access to their teams to inquire, are you noticing any changes in the behavior of your leader? And they also sat through interviews with me. So I ended up with this massive, massive mountain of data, and also measured them before and after with the GLP to kind of see, is there within 6 months any shift in their development? The bottom line was that 30% did shift, or the GLP said they did shift into a later stage. Now, after watching Aidan's research, and I highly encourage you to check out Aidan Thornton's dissertation. I'm currently having my mind blown and kind of trying to integrate what that means for us. But 30% developed and 70% didn't. And interestingly, 30% not only did not grow, but they regressed into an earlier stage after the program. And even more interestingly, the people who regressed were the latest stage people. So that was very, very intriguing to me. May not be surprising to some of you. So this is the short-ish story of what I set out to find. And the invitation that I've got for you is to experience what I found rather than me telling you what I discovered. Let me just very briefly share this. This fundamental difference between horizontal development and vertical development. And I know that vertical development in itself is a bit of a controversial term, and there are many arguments for which maybe we shouldn't be using it because it's a blanket statement for a host of complexity of development. But I think in the service of bringing this work to the general public, perhaps horizontal and vertical are the best terms that I think we have at the moment. But essentially, my understanding of it and the way I've treated it in my research is that horizontal defines what we know, the content of what we know. And as I was kind of going through the literature, I started to have an issue with this idea of hierarchy that is implied by horizontal and vertical. So I came up with a metaphor to accompany this, which is this metaphor of the piano. So when you learn to play the piano, you need to learn the technique. You need to learn musical theory. You need to learn all of the technical aspects of piano playing so you can be a decent piano player. And that is your horizontal development. But then your vertical development in the metaphor of the piano is how many octaves on your piano are you actually playing? How complex is the music that you're able to create? And what is your relationship to the music itself? So vertical would look at how we think, the mindsets we bring to the work we do, the structure of our minds rather than the content of our minds. So when I say that some of the participants in my research developed, something in the structure of their thinking seems to have shifted towards more complexity, towards more maturity. And for some of them, they seem to have lost access to the complexity and maturity they could access 6 months previously. So that to me was really, really intriguing. as to, what is it that actually happened and why. And I could only find one thing that was a clear differentiator between these two categories of people. And the experience I'm about to invite you into is what they came across or stumbled into instinctively. I then turned it into a practice that I'm now integrating into my work. So how much sense does this make? And any thoughts and just anything from anyone before I go forward? And maybe at the end, we can actually talk a little bit more if people are interested about, the metaphors we actually use in our work and how these metaphors can bring it to life in different ways or elicit different reactions in the people we're supporting in their own development.
Just to mention, it's a dialectical thinking group here. And I find myself always wondering about the distinctions that we make between vertical and horizontal, and how we might integrate that distinction, as well as the distinction between theory and practice, or theory and experience. So I think we must realize that these are just metaphors, and therefore they are simplifications, and the complexity is somehow bound up in the integration of the two.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree with that statement, Nick. Yeah. No, so I actually started to dive a bit more deeply into Otto's work, and I think I'm just starting to scratch the surface now through Ursula, who opened this amazing universe to me. So I was aware of Otto's work, but I didn't go deep in it. I hear you, and I absolutely resonate with that. And that definitely isn't the angle that I've taken. It is an interesting then question, perhaps maybe for afterwards when we're kind of sense making. But I'm wondering, how do we keep the integrity and the ethics of our practice while still staying open to learn and cross-pollinate? Because and I say this because when I came into it, I had no allegiance to any school of thought. And I just, like any, beginner researcher, I started to kind of do my lit review and see, who are the people who have measured adult development and how they have done it. And I ended up using the GLP because just practically Torbert's work was the most robust from a validation perspective. So there was enough data published. Apart from Lovinger's initial work, as a modern tool, the GLP was the one that had most written things about it that I could find. So I ended up kind of using his framework as my main measurement framework for that very reason. But in the process, as I've gotten to actually know some of the people in the space and, get to know them as humans as well as researchers, I've become very intrigued about, could we cross-pollinate more? But I'm also hearing you say, is there too much? Like, is there a moment when you're actually connecting this with stuff that has nothing to do with it? And where is that boundary? I don't know where it is exactly, but I'm intrigued by that question. I hear you. Yeah. But in terms of my theoretical framework, just to clarify what that was, the adult development part of it was informed by Kudgreuter and Torbert's and Keegan's work as the three big thinkers. And I also brought in transformative learning and Mezirov's work because as a practitioner, for me, it's always intriguing, how do we design learning development experiences that are actually developmental? So I felt that cross-pollination between adult development and transformative learning is an interesting intersection. So that is the academic, the theoretical lens, if you want, that I took to this. The experience I was suggesting we might, play with to see what I found. So the one thing that came out of it was that everybody during that year experienced profound disorienting dilemmas of all kinds and all types of dilemmas, from personal ones to professional ones. So nobody was spared, but how people dealt with these dilemmas was very, very different. So I would love as a practice if you'd be keen to play, and you don't have to share with anyone what you're working on. But if there is a dilemma that you're struggling with personally at the moment or professionally, you as a human on your own journey, I'd love to invite you to tap into a dilemma for a little bit and walk you through some steps that my research participants seem to have figured out instinctively, intuitively, that have turned out to be developmental for them. Just so you have a bit of a felt experience of it, so then we can kind of unpack it together. That will involve a bit of thinking, but it will involve quite a bit of feeling as well. So to preface that, and I'm pretty sure this group here is comfortable with getting into the deep spaces, but I always say, you know, if it feels uncomfortable at any point, you just don't want to do it anymore, just stop. But I am going to invite you into the body to feel some of your feelings at some point in this exercise. You happy to do that? Have a go at it? Okay. So you'll need some pen and paper, and we'll do an alternation of sort of guided meditation type of invitation with some journaling of things that you find in a few steps that we'll take together. So does everybody have a dilemma that they would be keen to work on for themselves in the next 20 minutes or so? And a dilemma has to feel like a tension between two opposing needs, could be a decision, could be something that really makes you feel torn in some way, and it feels unresolved and it feels a bit stuck. And you should be able to write it down or define it as, on the one hand, something, and on the other hand, something else. It's a bit of a polarity. We could think of it like that as well. But it has to feel, it's ideal if you choose one that really feels emotionally charged for you. You're really working your way through it and haven't found your way through it, but you know what the two sides of it are. So I invite you to just write down those two sides of your dilemma. I'll just bring them to mind if writing down is not an option. Okay. Everybody's got their dilemma down on paper? Yeah, awesome. So I'd love you to close your eyes for a few moments and just bring this dilemma to your awareness, to mind, and just notice what are the thoughts that come up. It's almost like you're taking on a role of journalist, documenting your own thinking about this dilemma. Not feelings yet, but just thoughts. What is the landscape of thoughts when you bring these two sides of the dilemma to mind? What thoughts emerge? There might be trains of thoughts, thought throwing you into another thought and another thought. You might want to follow those trains of thought for a bit, but I invite you not to start analyzing why you're having the thoughts. Just acknowledge the thoughts themselves. Just giving you a few seconds to be in that space of thought around this dilemma. Just maybe notice how busy is your mind right now? How many thoughts are there? Are there some thoughts that are just stronger? They just come up recurrently. They seem to take over the landscape. And trying to capture as many of them as you possibly can. Acknowledging them, not judging or analyzing, just noting them. And when you feel you've got a grasp, you might want to write down, record, just as a journalist would, record the thoughts that have come to your consciousness right now around this dilemma. Download them in a way from your mind onto paper. Try writing down as many as you can. Let me know when you feel like your mind is a bit emptier and much of the important thoughts are, or many of them are already down on paper. Okay, ready to go to the next step? Yep. So I'd love you to close your eyes again if you feel comfortable to do that. And now with your thoughts out of your mind. They're there, they're recorded, still holding the dilemma in awareness. I invite you to shift your attention to your body and just notice every sensation you possibly can that is present in your body and you know is connected to this dilemma. And I'm saying sensation and not emotion for now, because I'd love you to just observe anything that you can pick up, things that you might not even have a name for. What are you noticing from the tip of your toes to the top of your head? What is present in your body? And just acknowledging these sensations and acknowledging what happens when you acknowledge them. So if you find a sensation in the body that you maybe haven't been aware of before, that is present because you're holding this dilemma in awareness, what's your impulse? What do you feel like doing? Do you feel like leaning into it or studying it? Or do you feel like not wanting to feel it anymore, leaning away from it? Just acknowledge the impulses that arise when you identify any of these sensations. And if you love to learn in a visual way or a kinesthetic way, you might even notice colors or textures or certain consistencies associated with some of these sensations. Just notice what is there. And if you allow your attention to expand and really hold all of these sensations, are there emotions present in the body that you can name? And if yes, what are they? What are the emotions that this dilemma brings up in you? You might want to even be precise and find the emotion and the sensation and how they might be connected, and just observe that. And as you notice all of this and you notice your impulses towards all of these emotions and all of these sensations, I'd love you to bring in intentionally, purposefully, curiosity. You might even imagine you're pouring into yourself like a substance. Curiosity that comes and infuses your body and touches every one of these sensations you've just picked up. You might have one particular emotion or sensation that you really want to be curious about. You're intrigued by it. And you just allow yourself to be purely curious. You have no idea what you're going to find. You're not even trying to think about it. You're just experiencing the sensation of curiosity bearing on the emotion you picked up on earlier. And just breathing into this mix, all of the sensations, all of the emotions connected to your dilemma and curiosity together. What does that feel like in your body? And what are you noticing happen, if anything? Is anything changing at all? Do those sensations shift in any way as you brought in curiosity? Just acknowledging that for a moment. And as you do, you might feel moved to write down some of the things you found out, you discovered, you noticed, you felt. Or you might draw, you might sketch something. There might be a particular movement of the body that you feel moved to create. I'm particularly inviting you to notice and record any shifts that might have happened when you brought curiosity in, or anything you noticed before and after curiosity, anything that you found interesting or intriguing in some way. When you feel like you've you're complete with this step. Yep. So one last invitation for all of you is to just allow yourself now to go back to the dilemma and the original thoughts you had, and just bringing all of this wisdom you've tapped into, all of this learning from going into your body and bringing curiosity in, and just noticing what thoughts are present now about the dilemma. Noticing if anything has changed in your thinking, or if any new thoughts have arisen in some way. And even if there is any experiment or some sort of action impulse that arises from this reflection, something that maybe becomes possible, or a door that opens in some way that you might be keen to explore afterwards. And as before, if you want to jot down anything that you're finding interesting in the shifting landscape of your thinking, just to be able to return to it and maybe reflect a bit later on, you're welcome to take a moment and jot down. Is everybody feeling like they're complete? Yeah? Okay. Whoever might want to share a little bit of their observations and experience. I love that you're bringing up something really interesting, and I'll show you what actually came out of my data. That you said the fear didn't go away; it just moved into the background. So it's still there, but it's almost like the perspective on it has shifted. And you're also, but if I got correctly what you were saying, you can hold it without being paralyzed by it with this new perspective. So it's still there, but you can work with it. There's something becomes possible despite the fear. It's not like we've solved for the fear, but we've made it manageable in a way, or you've made it manageable, kind of playing with it in this way and bringing curiosity in. Yeah, thank you. Does anyone want to build on that, or does anyone hold a question that they'd like to bring in? I'll be happy to show you the science behind what we did and hear your thoughts afterwards. Thank you. I love the words you bring to it. Yeah, awesome. So would you like me to share with you the framework behind this, so then we can kind of open up the conversation and see what we make of it? Would that be okay to do? Yeah. So what I found as the only differentiator between the people who developed and the people who didn't develop was how they dealt with the emotional landscape that was brought up by their disorienting dilemmas. So when we face these dilemmas, these big conundrums where things just do not make sense anymore, all of us seem to drop into this space that Kaisu Malki, some of you might be familiar with her work. She's in the space of transformative learning. She's a researcher from Finland whose work I absolutely love. And she coined this term of edge emotions, which are all of the emotions we feel at the edge of our meaning making. It's that very moment where your current, it's almost in Bob Kegan's, for those of you who are familiar with his subject-object theory, and I know there are many of you who are, it's that moment when you feel the limits of that thing which you're subject to. It just doesn't make sense to you anymore, but you can't make it object. You can't look at your mindset yet. And there's that desperation, that locked kind of brain moment. And we feel these edge emotions. So what I found was that most of us don't want to feel them, and that's no surprise to anybody probably. And people not only don't want to feel them, but particularly in these highly competitive, performance-driven corporate contexts, people feel like something is very deeply wrong with them when they feel this stuff. So high-performing leaders don't want to feel fear and anxiety and confusion. That is very threatening. And there's a lot of shame that comes with that, which is another edge emotion. So most people in my study, when they felt this, they started to either shut down, distract themselves, blame the environment. So they would say things like, we went through immunity to change, and yes, it was an interesting intellectual exercise, but, I'm so busy and I didn't have time to apply anything. And other people talked about going through the immunity to change exercise, which Bob Keegan facilitated for that group, and saying it was terrifying. What I found just freaked me out. And I was so amazed that I was so freaked out. So that minority of people who shifted, they believe they have choice. So they chose to engage with these emotions instead of shun them or ignore them. They owned them as something that is theirs and there's value in it. And almost all of them brought in curiosity, which was super intriguing for me as a finding. So all of them spoke about, I was very intrigued as to why I was so anxious, why I was so fearful, why I was so, as you so beautifully just mentioned before, wow, why is this so much fear around something that I've done over and over again? And I've been through this before. It just is so intriguing to me. And when they did that, something really, really interesting seemed to happen, which I've ended up naming or calling the contrasting emotion space, where the original edge emotion doesn't go away, but it becomes bearable under the impact of curiosity. So that it's almost like a chemical reaction, or that's how I picture it, where curiosity tempers in a way those edge emotions. And for those of you who are into the neuroscience of this, I think it would be fascinating to actually look at the, sympathetic activation and parasympathetic activation, and how these emotions, when they come together, create a space of enough emotional balance so people can actually critically reflect. So in a way, if we accept that adult development, and I think in dialectical thinking for me is all about critical reflection at the end of the day, but we don't really critically reflect, I think, or I found, unless we're able to work our way through these super challenging and painful emotions that come with having our minds changed, with allowing our minds to be changed. So when people engaged and went into this space of contrasting emotions and were curious enough so the discomfort became bearable, they started to challenge their own assumptions, to kind of question their old patterns of thought. You were speaking about conditioning, Ellen, even being able to notice your own conditioning and kind of make it object. That's also powerful critical reflection, right? And from that came new meaning, new insight, and came new ways of doing things. And very interestingly, again, and not surprisingly, it kind of all fell into place once I kind of step back from it and see the whole picture. People who went through this process successfully, they were way more likely to experiment and act on their insights, which for us as learning designers, as facilitators, as coaches, that's our obsession, right? How do we help people to actually do the thing that they realize needs done, to close that action insight gap? So, and kind of my insight after the research was that perhaps the reason these people experimented more was that in the course of experimenting, they encounter edge emotions again, but now they have a way to deal with them. So you're going to go out and you're going to try a new behavior, and it's going to feel really, scary. So to give you an example, I had one of the research participants, he was a board member in the organization he was part of. And one of his disorienting dilemmas when he did his immunity to change was around a really hard topic that he had been procrastinating for months in bringing into the board as a topic, because it would have opened a can of worms and it would have made him the conflict generator, and he was the peacemaker. That was his identity. So he just could not conceive opening that can of worms, but he knew it had to be done. So he talked about how terrifying that was for him to actually go out and do this, have that actual conversation. So he designed this experiment for himself to actually bring that topic up in the next board meeting. And when I interviewed him, he described this whole process from his perspective as bringing in that conversation. how afraid he was, how fearful of the judgment of the others in the room, and how conscious of, how limiting his thinking had been up to that point. And interestingly enough, people did not react not even remotely as badly as he had anticipated. So that kind of reinforced his belief that, actually, to have courage and open up something that can be conflictual can also be healing. So I can still hold some of that identity that I have as a healer, which was part of the peacemaker kind of label that he had carried along with himself for a very long time. But I can still be a healer even when I'm in conflict or when I bring up stuff that makes other people uncomfortable. So there was a shift in awareness, and there was a shift in action, and there was a shift in self-concept. But at the core of it was this struggle with being curious about why emotionally it's so hard. And finally, the last element that came out was that the way to support this process for people is through inquiry, but inquiry including that emotional landscape, which I think for a lot of coaches who have a preference for the cognitive approach, that is an interesting stretch to really sit with our clients in the emotional space and in the somatic space alongside the cognitive. In facilitation, the same. I've experimented with this with, very interesting types of audiences like policing, where people have done the exercise you've just done now, and it led to some really fascinating conversations afterwards. So that kind of inquiry with action prompting, and also that capacity to hold space for the group to feel safe enough to tap into this discomfort. So I would say that the external circle is an invitation, a prompt for what can we do to hold this process for people. And I'm sure there would be other elements for it, but these are the ones that I have data on, and I can kind of say, I think they have value, or I'm confident to advocate for their value. So that's kind of the story of the frame behind. What do you think? Questions do you have? What reflections do you have? I'll be happy to share these slides if anybody needs them. I'm actually wondering, what this prompts for me is whether the context in which we use our cognition and emotions are very different. But I think human nature at the core is still human nature in these very, very different contexts. So I'm almost intrigued by this idea of how does actually cognition and emotion, how do they meet, and how do they end up, I don't know what the word is, enhancing each other for the benefit of the human growth in that context. So I don't know, how do we support leaders to have the emotional capacity to withstand the pain of cognitive dissonance when somebody proves them wrong? Because, I think cognitive dissonance, when you see counter evidence to your beliefs, is actually emotional pain. It's edge emotions. So if we were able to have this capacity to withstand that discomfort, maybe we would allow ourselves to be grown by others and grow others in turn more readily. And even in the scientific community, I've witnessed recently some very interesting debates, and you can see this playing out, the resistance we have when somebody brings in something that contradicts our worldview or our expertise or the stuff that we've defined ourselves through. That to me is again an example of being thrown in midst of edge emotions. And, where are we able to sit with curiosity and go, oh, this feels pretty uncomfortable. This person 20 years younger than me, kind of challenging something that I've been working on all my life. How do I stay open to that? And I think there are myriad other examples. I'm involved now in an interesting cross-national policing senior leadership development program with police leaders from 10 countries. And this is at the core of the conversations that they're having around, to have transnational collaboration. You actually have to also have an attention to self, and emotions in that environment are really anathema. But they're now discussing emotions and emotional maturity and vertical development as a thing. So yeah, I'm just intrigued by how many places this thing can find application in, or this way of thinking or inquiring. Yeah, I'd love, I mean, I'm there might be people who have a perspective on that question, or more perspectives on that question. But my prevalent thought on that is, have you ever seen a child who's not inherently curious? Because I have never seen one. I really think that curiosity is part of our fundamental human going towards seeking impulse. So I wonder if, you know, what we perceive as a lack of curiosity is actually the result of trauma and kind of not wanting to lean into these spaces. And I'm sure all of you working with leaders have heard that, you know I need to think about this stuff, but it's just terrifying to go there because I don't know what I'll find. And if I tap into what I feel, that'll be, you know, potentially terrifying, or potentially, what if I can't bring myself back from that? So I wonder if it's lack of curiosity, or it's actually an overwhelm of, you know, it's just too much of. Yes, I love this. Yes, Theo Dawson. And this makes me also think of Maria Montessori and her horme, the Greek word that she used to define that life force present in every child, where if you create the context, they just go for it. They're always seeking to learn. It's so fundamental. Yeah. I love how your mind goes to application, because that is what I'm really intrigued by. You know, if there is a bit of a nugget of value in this, in the idea of bringing curiosity to bear on our difficult emotions, so we make space, you know, what are creative ways to integrate this with different practices that different people are doing, or learn from each other? You know, how do you do it? How might I do it? I think there's so much value in that. So I think it's super important what you're saying, because what I noticed is nobody in my research spoke about feeling positively from being curious about their negative emotions. So that was not the outcome. It was more the fear receding a little bit into the background and making room for possibility. So I make it a point in my practice to actually normalize the discomfort, not positivize it. Almost, and I'll give you an example that it's been so striking and personal to me. When I was writing my dissertation, my daughter was 6 and she was playing the piano downstairs, and I was writing up here in my office. And I heard her stop, like make a mistake, make a second mistake, and then stop and throw the book and start crying and shouting, "I'm never playing piano again." And I was wondering, how do I explain this stuff to a 6-year-old in a way that makes sense to them and is helpful? And you know how kids at that age, they have pains in their joints frequently. So we often spoke about the pains in her joints because she's growing up, and it's just unpleasant, but it's part of growing up. So it occurred to me to make this analogy. And I said to her, "So how are you feeling?" "I'm angry and this is stupid and I can't get it." And I said, "Look, do you know those pains in your joints?" "Yes." "Do you like them?" "No." "Do you accept them?" "Yes, because this means that I grow up." "Okay, what if this is pain in your mind and your heart? This frustration, this anger you're feeling is the growth pain in your mind. And it's not going to go away. It's just a sign that your mind is growing." Honestly, it's been, and she's 8 now, 3 years later, it's been just game changing. And she's not in any shape or form more willing to be frustrated, to be clear. She still doesn't enjoy it. I don't enjoy it, but there's an acceptance of it. So I feel, I don't know if this touches or answers your question, but that is my way of not positivizing it, but normalizing it. And for me, these are very different things. It's almost, you know, how do we recognize the growth pains in our hearts from healing from a painful past, from healing from recent pain, and outgrowing that pain without trying. And I also think, in a way, if you think of toxic positivity and how positive psychology has been misused in many ways to kind of put forward this lens of everything has to be smiles and joy, and it's not. That to me is also avoiding edge emotions. And I don't think we're doing the work when we're positivizing. We're actually avoiding doing the work.
But yeah,
You know, it's
probably why the
interesting,
top.
and I'm inviting you to experiment with this really, because I think it's also new, and I'm just learning. I'm experimenting myself. So the more of us play with this, and maybe we share what we're learning, the more we can actually learn. But I noticed that the power of this thing seems to be when you bring curiosity not to your thoughts or your cognition, but to your body. Almost like bring curiosity in as a sensation. You might have no idea what is actually occurring, but something is occurring. So it's almost like a somatic invitation to access curiosity to soothe your soma so you can hold more in your mind. So in a way, when you say error, to me, that makes me think of cognition. Am I right or am I wrong? But I think if I bring this just into the body first, it doesn't even matter if I'm right or wrong. This is what I'm feeling. And I'm just being curious about what I'm feeling in this moment. And through the simple act or choice of being curious, something really powerful happens where I relax enough. I can withstand that discomfort enough for my mind to go to new places, perhaps in dialogue with other minds. So it doesn't have to be a solo exercise. I think it's, to Ansi's point, when you do it together, it is probably 10 times more powerful when you do it with other people. But it's so often people go, oh, and when I ask myself a question about those thoughts, 20 other thoughts come. But it's not about asking a question, it's about trying to access the emotion of curiosity in your own gut, in your body, in wherever you feel in your feelings, in your throat. Does that distinction make sense? It is 100%. I think that's the word. I love that distinction. I think it's so important. And I also wonder, Jonathan, in the context of practice, how confusing can it get when we, like, even it's reminding me, are we defining the terms that we're using? Because I think the majority of people in the context that I work in, and I'm sure those you work in like professional spaces, when you say cognitive, people think just rational, analytical, abstract. And it's when we talk about the thing or we think about the thing, but we don't want to feel the thing. That's kind of my informal way of trying to make sense of, I think, what you just said, when in fact, they're never unrelated. And in a way, you could also say people might sit in the hyper rational realm as a way to avoid feeling the pain of whatever it is that they're not wanting to feel. Yeah, it's interesting. And also, Andres, I'm intrigued by your comment there that, you know, seeking curiosity kills curiosity. And I was wondering if you might want to just maybe share a bit more about your thinking when you say that. And so is that in a way kind of inviting us to think, if you are to introduce this or invite people into this kind of activity, how do you make sure? I don't even know what the answer is, but I'm thinking, when I hear you talk, I think the people in my study, what it seemed to me was that they had this belief that those emotions held some value. So in the, you know, love for truth kind of principle, they did believe there was value in those emotions, and that prompted their curiosity. It was like, oh, my body is selling me this thing. There must be truth in it. There must be value in it, even if I don't like what I'm feeling. So what is it? So then curiosity, in a sense, emerged as a result of that assumption, of that underlying assumption, versus I'm feeling anxiety, something's wrong with me, I've got to fix it. So I think the belief system or the assumptions were very different in the two cases. And then now, as a practitioner, I'm wondering, how do you teach this thing without forcing it? Or how do you teach this thing in a way where people access something that is already in them? To kind of, yeah, connect it back to what you say. How do we not seek in a way that kills it, but harness it in service of growth? It's never my opening activity when I work with a group, to put it that way. But I have noticed that once you have trust with a group, this kind of work becomes, people are hungry for this kind of work. When the space is safe and interesting and their brains are stimulated, I think that's where that intellectual aspect can work in our favor, where there's substance to it in a way where there's an explanation, but let's have an experience. So then it's almost like the rational mind goes, okay, I'm not completely out of my depth here. I'm gonna just tap into something a bit different. But yeah, if people experiment with versions of this, or see links with your own work and might want to share, I would love to learn from your wisdom.
It's been a fantastic session. And if I can end on a slightly dialectical note, I think following Ursula's prompt, I kind of see that the thinking system is sometimes in conflict with the feeling system in people, and this conflict is preventing development. But what you pointed to today is the idea of curiosity, which perhaps belongs to both systems, both thinking and feeling, acts as some kind of bridge at reconciling the conflict between those two systems and therefore enabling development. So that's a great dialectical note to end on. And I hope people will continue the dialogue with you, because sharing knowledge in this way is so valuable. And now we have these Zoom technologies that's so easy to do. So once again, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for participating today.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful being here and learning with all of you. Looking forward to the follow-up conversations. Thank you.